Do you know what it feels like to be erased from your own life, quietly, politely, as if you were never meant to be there in the first place? I didn't. Not until the morning a wedding planner called me with a voice so careful it almost sounded rehearsed. "I'm so sorry," she said. "But your husband has removed your name from the guest list." Removed. Not forgotten. Not mistaken. Removed. As if I were a typo in a document he had already decided to rewrite. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the calendar where I had circled that date months ago. The wedding of his younger brother. A family event I had helped plan. A celebration I had funded. And suddenly, I didn't belong. I asked her to repeat it. Not because I hadn't heard, but because I needed to understand how something like that could happen without warning. Without a conversation. Without even the decency of an argument. He said it was a final decision. She added, softer this time, as if lowering her voice would make it less real. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because something inside me had just shifted. Quietly. Completely. And in that moment, I realized something he hadn't. He thought removing me from the guest list would keep me out of the wedding. He didn't realize I was already part of the system that made the wedding possible. The house was silent when I ended the call. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that felt deliberate. Like everything inside it had already chosen a side. I walked into the kitchen. The same place where I had spent weeks reviewing menus. Coordinating vendors. Approving final details for a wedding that wasn't even mine. I remembered the spreadsheets. The late-night calls. The quiet pride I felt knowing everything would come together perfectly. And now, I wasn't even invited. There's a certain kind of betrayal that doesn't come with shouting or anger. It arrives quietly, dressed in logic, disguised as necessity. That was how Dylan operated. Always calm. Always reasonable. Always one step ahead, at least. That's what he believed. I replayed the last conversation we had about the wedding. He had been distant, distracted, answering questions without really engaging. At the time, I told myself it was stress. Weddings do that to people. They create pressure, expectations, endless details to manage. I never considered that I was the detail being managed. It wasn't just the invitation. It was the decision behind it. The confidence. The assumption that I would accept it. That I would step aside quietly, like I had done before in smaller moments that suddenly didn't feel so small anymore. I walked into the study and opened my laptop. Not out of panic, not even out of anger. Just clarity, the kind that comes when everything finally aligns in a way you can't ignore. I didn't need to ask why. I needed to understand how. The wedding files were still there, exactly where I had organized them. Contracts. Payment records, vendor agreements, every detail documented, categorized, easy to access. I had always been meticulous like that. Dylan used to joke about it, said I liked control too much. Maybe he was right. I opened the main contract with the venue. My name was still there, not just listed but attached to the primary account. I scrolled further. Payment confirmations, authorization structures, access permissions. Each line was a piece of something larger, something he clearly hadn't taken the time to understand. Or maybe he didn't think he needed to. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just still. Like the moment before something begins. People think power is loud, that it announces itself, demands attention, forces its presence into a room. But real power doesn't work like that. It sits quietly in the background, embedded in systems, written into agreements, waiting for someone who understands how to use it. Dylan thought he had control because he made a decision. He didn't realize control isn't about decisions. It's about structure. I closed the contract and stared at the screen for a moment longer, not searching for answers anymore, just confirming what I already knew. He hadn't removed me from the wedding. He had only removed himself from the part of it he didn't understand. And the difference between those two things was everything. The first thing I realized was that nothing had actually changed, only my position in it. The contracts were still valid. The payments had been processed. The vendors were confirmed. The venue was secured. Everything was exactly where it had always been, untouched and intact. The only difference was that Dylan had decided I shouldn't be seen. I opened the vendor agreement folder one by one, not rushing, not searching for something dramatic, just reading, understanding, verifying. The catering contract still listed me as the primary financial contact. The venue authorization still required my approval for final execution changes. Even the event insurance policy had my name attached to the controlling account. He hadn't removed me. He had only removed my name from the guest list. And somehow, he thought that was enough. I almost laughed. But the feeling didn't reach that far. It stopped somewhere between disbelief and something quieter, something sharper. There's a difference between being excluded and being erased. One is emotional. The other is structural. And Dylan had failed at both. I leaned forward, scrolling through the payment history. Every major transaction tied back to the same account, mine. Deposits, milestone payments, final balances. He had signed off on things. Yes. Approved decisions. Given instructions. But financially, legally, the system still pointed to me, which meant something very simple. He could remove me from the room, but not from the foundation. I stood up and walked to the window, letting the sunlight hit my face for a moment. It wasn't about anger. Not anymore. Anger demands reaction. This required precision. I thought back to the moment he must have made that call. Calm, confident, probably even polite, telling the planner to remove my name. Final decision. No discussion needed. That's how people make mistakes like this. Not out of recklessness, but out of certainty. He was certain I wouldn't question it. Certain I wouldn't push back. Certain I would accept it the way I had accepted other things before. And maybe that was his biggest miscalculation. Not the contracts. Not the money. Meh. I walked back to the desk and opened the venue management portal. The login credentials still worked. Of course they did. My access hadn't been revoked. Because revoking it would require a process he clearly didn't know existed. The dashboard loaded slowly, displaying everything in clean, organized sections, guest coordination, vendor timelines, authorization layers, each part connected to the next, forming a system that didn't rely on opinions or decisions, only permissions. And permissions don't change just because someone wants them to. I clicked into the authorization settings and read through the hierarchy. Primary controller, secondary approver, event coordinator, each role defined, each level clearly structured. My name sat at the top, unchanged, untouched. I exhaled slowly, not because I was surprised, but because the clarity was complete now. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty about where things stood. Dylan hadn't removed me from anything that mattered. He had only removed himself from understanding how it worked. The irony settled in quietly. For weeks, I had been the one ensuring everything would run smoothly, double-checking details, confirming timelines, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. I had built a system that could hold together under pressure, and now, he was about to test that system without realizing who it was built for. I closed the portal and reached for my phone, scrolling through the contact list. Names I recognized immediately. People I had spoken to, coordinated with, aligned everything with. None of them had any reason to question my role, because my role hadn't changed. Only his perception of it had. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. This wasn't the moment for action. It was the moment for understanding timing. People rush when they feel wronged. They react, confront, demand explanations. They try to fix things immediately, as if speed will restore control. But control doesn't come from reacting faster. It comes from knowing when not to move. I set the phone down and looked back at the screen, at the structure I had spent so much time building. Every detail was still in place, waiting, stable, predictable, quiet. exactly the way systems are supposed to be. And that's when the thought became clear, not as an idea, but as a certainty. If everything was still connected to me, then everything could still be controlled by me. Not emotionally. Not visibly. Structurally. I didn't need to argue with him. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't even need him to understand what he had done. Because the system already did. And systems don't negotiate. They respond. I closed the laptop gently. The sound soft but final. The house was still silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt aligned, like every piece had settled into the right place, waiting for the moment it would matter. Dylan thought he had made a decision. What he didn't realize was that he had triggered a process. And processes don't stop just because someone changes their mind. They follow through, all the way to the end. I didn't confront him that night. Dylan came home late, the same way he had been for weeks, quietly, as if the house were a place he passed through rather than lived in. I was in the living room, a book open in my hands, though I hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. I heard his keys on the table, the soft shuffle of his jacket, the familiar rhythm of someone who believed everything was still under control. He glanced at me briefly. "You're still up?" I nodded. Calm. Neutral. Just reading. There was a pause. Not long enough to feel intentional, but long enough for something unspoken to exist between us. He didn't mention the call. Didn't mention the wedding. Didn't mention anything at all. That was the first confirmation. This wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. He moved past me into the kitchen, opening cabinets, pouring himself a drink like any other night. Normal. Controlled. Predictable. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed it too. I watched him for a moment longer before looking back down at the book. Not because I was dismissing him, but because I was already past the need for reaction. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe there's nothing to explain. He sat across from me a few minutes later, scrolling through his phone, occasionally tapping the screen with quiet focus. I wondered briefly what he was reading. Messages. Confirmations. Last-minute arrangements for a wedding that I was no longer allowed to attend. Or maybe something else entirely. It didn't matter. What mattered was what he wasn't saying. "You've been busy," I said lightly, as if making conversation, not observation. He didn't look up. "It's been a lot. Wedding stuff." "Yeah," he replied. Short. Automatic. Another pause. I let it stretch this time. Not uncomfortable. "Just present, and everything's set." I asked. He nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "Everything's handled." Handled. I almost smiled. There's something dangerous about that word. It suggests finality, control, completion. It's what people say when they want to believe there are no loose ends left. But there are always loose ends. You just don't see them until they tighten. "That's good," I said quietly. And that was it. No confrontation. No accusation. No questions about why I had been removed from something I had helped build. Because I didn't need his explanation. I already had the truth. Later that night, after he went to bed, I returned to the study. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was seeing it clearly for the first time. Every shared space, every decision, every quiet compromise that had led us here. I sat down and opened the files again, not to confirm what I already knew, but to look deeper. Not just at the contracts, but at the patterns, decisions Dylan had made over time. Small shifts in control, subtle exclusions that didn't seem significant in isolation, but formed something else when viewed together. A pattern of assumption, a pattern of believing that what wasn't challenged belonged to him. I opened the communication logs between vendors, messages I had sent, instructions I had confirmed, changes I had approved. My presence was everywhere in the structure, even if it had been quietly ignored in the surface narrative. That was the second confirmation. I hadn't just participated in this system. I had built it. And people rarely understand the systems they didn't build themselves. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle fully. This wasn't about one decision. It wasn't about a guest list or a single event. It was about a shift in power that had been happening slowly, almost invisibly. Until now. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking time in a way that suddenly felt more relevant than before. Not because I was running out of it, but because I was beginning to understand how to use it. Timing isn't about urgency. It's about alignment. I picked up my phone and opened a message thread with the wedding planner. Her last message was still there. Polite and apologetic, as if she had delivered something she didn't fully agree with but had no authority to question. I typed a response, then paused. Not yet. There was a difference between knowing what to do and knowing when to do it. And I wasn't interested in creating a reaction. I was interested in creating an outcome. I set the phone back down and closed my eyes for a moment. Not out of exhaustion, but focus, mapping out the structure in my mind, the dependencies, the points of control, the places where a small shift could create a larger effect. Not chaos. Never chaos. Precision. That was the difference between reacting and acting. Dylan believed he had already made the final move. He thought the story had reached its conclusion. But what he didn't understand was that he had only defined the starting point. I stood up, turning off the light as I left the study. The hallway was dark, quiet, familiar, the kind of quiet that used to feel comfortable. Now it felt anticipatory, like everything was waiting. He slept peacefully when I entered the bedroom, unaware, undisturbed, his breathing steady, his expression relaxed. There was no sign of doubt, no hint that anything had shifted. And that was the third confirmation. He had no idea what was coming. I lay down beside him, staring at the ceiling, not thinking about what I had lost, but what I had just regained: clarity, control, and most importantly, timing. Because the truth isn't revealed in the moment something is taken from you. It's revealed in the moment you decide what happens next. And I had already decided. I just hadn't told anyone yet. The next morning felt almost ordinary. Sunlight moved across the kitchen counter the same way it always did. Quiet and predictable, touching the edges of things that hadn't changed. The coffee machine hummed softly, filling the space with a familiar rhythm that once meant routine. Now it meant contrast. Dylan sat across from me, scrolling through his phone again, the screen reflecting faintly in his eyes. He looked relaxed, focused, as if everything in his world was moving exactly the way he intended. "Big day coming up," I said, pouring coffee into my cup. He nodded without looking up. "Yeah, just a few final things to confirm. Anything I can help with?" The question lingered between us for a second longer than it should have. Not because it was unusual, but because it shouldn't have been asked at all, not anymore. He finally looked at me, offering a small, controlled smile. "No, it's all handled." Handled. There it was again. I nodded, taking a sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in slowly. "That's good." He went back to his phone. Conversation closed. Simple, efficient, final. Except it wasn't. I finished my coffee in silence, observing without appearing to, the way he checked messages, the slight tension in his jaw when something didn't go exactly as expected, the brief flickers of irritation that he smoothed over quickly, as if maintaining control required constant adjustment. It was subtle, but it was there. After he left, the house returned to its quiet state. But this time it felt active, not in sound, but in structure, like everything inside it was connected to something larger, something already in motion. I walked back into the study and opened my laptop again, not searching anymore, but mapping. The contracts were only one part of the system. The visible part. What mattered more were the connections between them, the dependencies, the conditions, the invisible lines that determined how one action affected another. I opened the venue agreement again, scrolling past the main terms until I reached the operational clauses, the sections most people ignored, the ones written in precise language, designed not to be noticed unless something went wrong. That's where control lives. Clause by clause, I read through them carefully. Not quickly. Not casually. Every word had weight. Every condition created a possibility. Suspension under risk conditions. Authorization reassignment upon breach. Service delay pending verification. I paused there, rereading that line. Pending verification. Not denial. Not cancellation. Just delay. A simple word, but powerful. Because delay doesn't raise alarms. It doesn't create immediate conflict. It creates uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads. I leaned back, considering it. Not as an idea, but as part of a sequence. One small shift. Triggering another. Then another. Not enough to break anything immediately, but enough to weaken it. I opened the payment logs again, cross-referencing them with the contract conditions. Each transaction tied to a specific obligation. Each obligation linked to a timeline. Each timeline dependent on confirmation. It was all connected. And the more I looked at it, the clearer it became. Dylan hadn't just overlooked a detail. He had overlooked the entire structure. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, letting the thought settle into something solid. This wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about confrontation or correction in the way most people understood it. It was about alignment. If a system is built on assumptions, then all you have to do is remove one assumption and everything else adjusts. Not instantly, but inevitably. I returned to the study and picked up my phone again, this time scrolling through contacts with intention. The planner, the venue coordinator, the catering manager. Names that weren't just people, but points of connection within the system. I selected one, then stopped. Timing. It wasn't about what I could do. It was about when it would matter. I placed the phone back on the desk and looked at the calendar instead. The wedding date circled clearly, unchanged. Approaching with quiet certainty. Days. Not weeks. Not hours. Days. Enough time for preparation. Not enough time for recovery. That was the balance. I closed the calendar and opened a blank document. Not to write something emotional or reactive, but to outline steps, sequences, dependencies. If this, then that. If delayed, then adjusted. If questioned, then verified. Each line building on the last, forming something that didn't look like disruption, but functioned as one. That's the difference between chaos and structure. Chaos is loud. Structure is quiet. I paused, looking at the outline forming on the screen. It didn't feel like revenge. Not even close. Revenge is immediate, emotional, visible. This was none of those things. This was inevitable. I saved the document and closed it, not needing to look at it anymore. It was already clear in my mind. The system didn't need to be broken. It just needed to respond. I turned off the laptop and stood up, walking toward the window again. Outside, everything looked normal. Cars passing. People moving through their day without knowing anything about what was unfolding beneath the surface. That's how it always is. The most important shifts happen where no one is looking. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, watching the reflection instead of the street. My expression was calm, steady, not the face of someone reacting to being excluded, the face of someone who had already moved past that moment. Because the truth is, being removed from the guest list didn't matter. Not anymore. What mattered was understanding why it had happened. And more importantly, what it had activated. Dylan thought he had simplified the situation. He believed he had removed a complication. But what he actually did was create a condition. And conditions don't stay isolated. They expand. They connect. They resolve themselves in ways no one expects. I stepped back from the window, the decision no longer forming but complete. The plan wasn't something I needed to build anymore. It was something I needed to execute. Carefully, quietly, at the exact moment it would matter most. Because when everything is structured correctly, you don't need to force the outcome. You just need to let it happen. I didn't start with the venue. That would have been too obvious. Too direct. People notice when the center shifts. They react. They compensate. They try to fix it. But systems don't break from the center. They break from the edges. I sat in the study that afternoon, phone in hand, scrolling through the contact list again. Not hesitating this time. Just choosing carefully. Every name represented a connection. And every connection had a function. I selected the catering manager first. Not because it was the most important piece, but because it was one of the most sensitive. Food timing. Delivery schedules. Confirmation windows. Everything had to align perfectly for it to work. And when it didn't, people noticed. The call connected on the second ring. "Hi, this is Erin," I said. Calm. Familiar. I just wanted to confirm a few final details before the event. Her tone shifted immediately. Professional and responsive. "Of course. Everything is on schedule. We finalized the delivery window yesterday." "I saw that," I replied, glancing at the screen in front of me. "I just need to clarify one thing regarding verification protocols." A pause. "Subtle verification." "Yes," I continued smoothly. "There were a few updates on the account, and I want to make sure everything aligns with your internal process. If there's any discrepancy, even minor, I'd prefer it be flagged before execution." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "Well, if there's any inconsistency, we do need to hold service until it's confirmed," she said carefully. "Exactly," I said softly. That's all I needed to confirm. I ended the call without adding anything else. No instructions. No changes. Just alignment. I placed the phone down and leaned back, letting the silence settle again. Nothing had changed on the surface. The schedule remained intact. The deliveries were still planned. The confirmations were still in place. But now, there was a condition. And conditions wait. I moved to the next contact, the hotel coordinator. This one was even more delicate. Room allocations. Guest confirmations. Priority bookings. A system built on precision and expectation. "Hi, this is Erin. I just wanted to double-check the reservation structure for the wedding block." She sounded confident. "Everything is confirmed. All rooms are secured under the event account." "I understand," I said. "I just need to confirm the authorization chain. In case of any account irregularities, what's your protocol?" A brief hesitation. "We would need to verify before releasing access," she replied. "Perfect," I said. That's exactly what I needed. Again, no changes, no requests, just confirmation. I ended the call and stared at the screen for a moment, not thinking about what I had said, but what had been established. 2 points. Independent, stable, and now connected by the same condition. Verification. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, letting the process unfold in my mind. Each conversation had been simple, harmless, routine. Nothing that would raise suspicion, nothing that would trigger a response. But together, they formed something else. Not a disruption, a framework. I returned to the desk and opened the document I had started earlier. The outline was still there, clean and structured. I added 2 lines. Catering, hold on discrepancy. Hotel, verify before release. I paused, then added a 3rd. Venue, pending. The center would come last. Always. Because once the center shifts, everything else collapses faster. I closed the document again, not needing to refine it further. The plan wasn't complicated. It didn't rely on force or confrontation. It relied on sequence. And sequence creates inevitability. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. A message from Dylan. Everything good. I looked at the screen for a moment before replying. Yes, everything's fine. I sent it without hesitation, without overthinking. Because it was true. Everything was fine. Exactly the way it needed to be. I set the phone down and walked back to the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the street. People moved through their routines, unaware of anything beyond their own immediate concerns. That's how it always is. Systems don't announce themselves when they shift. They adjust quietly. Until the moment they don't. I thought about the wedding day, not as an event, but as a convergence point. All the timelines meeting, all the dependencies aligning, every piece expecting the others to function exactly as planned. And they would, until they didn't. I turned away from the window and picked up the phone again, scrolling through the remaining contacts. The venue coordinator's name sat there, waiting. Not yet. The center required precision. More than the edges. More than the rest. Because once it moved, there would be no return. I placed the phone back down and exhaled slowly. Not out of tension, but control. The kind that comes when everything is already in place, waiting for the final step. Dylan thought the wedding was approaching its completion. He believed everything was coming together. But what he didn't understand was that the system wasn't building toward a celebration. It was building toward a response. And responses don't need permission. They just need the right conditions. I sat back down, folding my hands loosely on the desk, letting the quiet settle once more. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt uncertain. Just aligned. The edges were set. The structure was ready. All that remained was the moment it would all connect. And when it did, there wouldn't be anything left to fix. I waited another day before touching the center. Not because I needed more time, but because the system needed to settle. The edges had already been aligned. The conditions were in place. Now it was about precision, one move. Not several. I opened the venue contract again. Slower this time. Reading it not as a participant, but as the person who understood what it was designed to do. Most people skim contracts. They look for totals, dates, signatures. They don't read the operational clauses. They don't study the structure behind the agreement. That's where the control is. My eyes stopped on a section I had already seen before. But now it meant something different. Operational authority may be reassigned under conditions of financial discrepancy or contractual risk. I read it again. Not because it was unclear, but because it was exact. Reassigned. Not removed. Not negotiated. Reassigned. I leaned back in my chair, letting the word settle. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural. And procedures don't require permission. They require conditions. I opened the payment records again, cross-checking timestamps, confirmation logs, and approval sequences. Every transaction had a record. Every record created a trail. And trails create leverage. Dylan had assumed that signing approvals meant control, that being visible in the process meant ownership. But visibility isn't authority. Structure is. I reached for my phone and selected the venue coordinator's contact. My thumb hovered over the call button for a moment, not hesitating. Just confirming the sequence in my mind one last time. Edges. Conditions. Center. I pressed call. "Hi, this is Erin," I said when she answered. My voice steady. Familiar. "I just need to review one final detail regarding the authorization structure before the event." She responded immediately. Professional as always. "Of course. Everything is confirmed on our end." "I'm sure it is," I replied calmly. "This is just about protocol. In the event of a financial discrepancy or unresolved verification, how is operational authority handled?" There was a pause, subtle but noticeable. "Well, in that case, authority would shift to the primary account holder until the issue is resolved." "Exactly," I said softly. "That's what I needed to confirm." I ended the call without elaborating. No explanation. No warning. Just confirmation. I set the phone down slowly and looked at the screen in front of me. Nothing had changed. No alerts. No notifications. No visible difference in the system. But everything had changed. Because now the center was aligned with the edges. Catering would hold under discrepancy. Hotel would verify before release. Venue would reassign authority under risk. 3 independent systems. 1 shared condition. I stood up and walked out of the study. The quiet of the house wrapping around me again. It no longer felt empty or still. It felt complete. The plan wasn't something I was building anymore. It was something that existed. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I thought about what came next. Nothing. That was the part most people misunderstand. They think action requires constant movement. That once something is set in motion, you have to keep pushing it forward. But that's not how systems work. Once they're aligned, they move on their own. I placed the glass down and leaned against the counter, letting the realization settle fully. Dylan hadn't just excluded me from the wedding. He had positioned himself inside a structure he didn't control. And now, every part of that structure was waiting for a single condition to activate. Not a confrontation. Not an argument. Just a trigger. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of the silence. Another message from Dylan. Final walkthrough tomorrow. Everything's set. I read it once. Then again. Not because it mattered, but because of what it represented. Confidence. Certainty. The belief that everything was under control. I typed a response without thinking too much about it. Sounds good. 2 words. Simple. Neutral. Final. I sent the message and set the phone aside, feeling no urgency to follow up. No need to ask questions or offer input, because there was nothing left to discuss. The system was already in place. I walked back to the study and sat down, opening the calendar one last time. The wedding date was closer now. Not distant, not abstract. Immediate. I traced the timeline in my mind, not imagining outcomes, but confirming sequences. When things would align, when the conditions would intersect, when the system would respond, not if, when. I closed the calendar and turned off the screen. The room falling into a soft, quiet stillness. There was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to adjust. Everything had already been decided, not by emotion, not by impulse, but by structure. And structure doesn't hesitate. It executes. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Not resting, just letting the clarity settle one final time. Dylan thought he had taken control by making a decision. He believed he had simplified the situation by removing me from it. But what he didn't understand was that control isn't about who makes the decision. It's about who defines the conditions. And now, the conditions were mine. All that remained was time. And time doesn't stop for anyone. Not even for people who think they're in control. Knowing the system wasn't enough. Understanding how everything connected, how each piece depended on the next, gave me clarity, but clarity alone doesn't create outcomes. Timing does. And timing isn't about acting quickly. It's about acting when nothing can be undone. I sat in the study again. The same quiet space that had become less of a room and more of a control point. The outline was already in place. The conditions were set. The edges in the center aligned. Now I needed to decide when it would break. Not how, not if, when. I opened the calendar and looked at the wedding day. Not as a date, but as a sequence of moments. Arrival, setup, coordination, ceremony. Each phase layered on top of the next. Each one dependent on confirmation, timing, and trust. If I moved too early, they would adjust. If I waited too long, it would lose impact. But if I chose the exact moment when everything depended on everything else, there would be no recovery. I closed the calendar slowly, letting the answer settle without forcing it. The ceremony. Not before, not after, right before everything needed to function perfectly. That was the point. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands loosely, not thinking about what I was going to do. But what I wasn't going to do, I wasn't going to confront Dylan. I wasn't going to expose Tiffany. I wasn't going to create a scene. Because scenes create sympathy, and sympathy creates recovery. That wasn't the goal. The goal was collapse. Quiet. Complete. Undeniable. I opened the contract files again, scanning through the clauses one last time. Not searching for anything new, just confirming the structure I was about to activate. Termination conditions. Authorization reassignment. Operational suspension under risk. Each clause independent, each clause harmless on its own, but together, decisive. I stopped on the section Dylan had signed. His digital signature sitting beneath terms he clearly hadn't read closely enough. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was something more common. Assumption. He assumed that being present in the process meant understanding it. He assumed that approval meant control. He assumed that removing me meant removing my influence. I let my eyes linger on the signature for a moment before closing the file. He had already agreed to everything that was about to happen. He just didn't know it yet. I reached for the document I had created earlier. The outline of dependencies and triggers. It was simple. Clean. Almost minimal. No unnecessary steps. No redundancy. Just sequence. Catering would hold under discrepancy. Hotel would delay under verification. Venue would reassign authority under risk. 3 points. Separate. Connected. All waiting for the same condition. I added one final note at the bottom. Trigger. Financial inconsistency flagged. That was it. Not dramatic. Not complicated. Just enough. I closed the document and didn't reopen it. There was nothing left to adjust. The plan wasn't something that needed refinement anymore. It was something that needed discipline. And discipline means restraint. My phone buzzed softly again. Another message from Dylan. Rehearsal went well. Everything's perfect. I read it once, letting the words sit there. Perfect. That's what people say when they stop looking. When they believe there's nothing left to question. I typed a reply. I'm glad. 2 words. No emotion. No hesitation. I sent it and set the phone aside. Not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because there was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been decided. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, letting the quiet surround me again. It didn't feel tense. It didn't feel heavy. It felt stable, like everything was exactly where it needed to be. I paused near the hallway mirror, catching my reflection for a brief moment. There was no anger in my expression, no urgency, no visible sign of what was coming. Just calm. That's what control looks like. Not loud, not reactive. Still, I thought about Logan for a moment, about where he stood in all of this. He wasn't part of the plan, not directly, but he was connected to it, tied to the structure through family, through proximity, through trust. For a brief second, I considered adjusting something, softening an edge, reducing an impact. Then I let the thought pass. This wasn't about targeting people. It was about allowing consequences. And consequences don't negotiate. They don't adjust themselves to make things easier. They follow through. I walked back into the study and turned off the lights, leaving the room in darkness. The outline, the contracts, the structure, it was all still there. It didn't need me anymore. That's how you know something is ready. When it no longer depends on your presence to exist. I moved toward the bedroom, the house quiet around me. Every step measured, not out of caution, but intention. Tomorrow would come. The wedding day would arrive. Everything would unfold exactly the way it was supposed to. From the outside, it would look perfect, flawless, controlled. But underneath, the system was already waiting. And systems don't hesitate when the moment comes. They execute, all at once, without warning, without permission. And when they do, there's nothing left to stop them. The morning arrived exactly the way it was supposed to. Bright, quiet, almost too perfect. Sunlight spilled across the venue entrance, catching the polished glass and white stone like it had been designed for this moment. Cars pulled in one after another, guests stepping out in careful elegance, laughter already filling the air before the ceremony had even begun. Everything looked flawless. That's how systems fail, when nothing appears wrong. I stepped out of the car without hesitation, adjusting my sleeve as if I had always belonged there. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. The staff at the entrance greeted me with the same polite professionalism they had shown every time before, because nothing in their system said I shouldn't be there. I wasn't on the guest list, but I was still in the structure. Inside, the venue was already alive with movement. Coordinators checking timelines, servers preparing trays, guests gathering in small circles, their conversations light, unaware. Music played softly in the background, just enough to fill the silence without overpowering it. I walked through it all without drawing attention, not hiding, just existing. That's the difference. People notice what doesn't belong. They don't question what fits into the system they trust. Across the room, I saw Dylan. He stood near the center, exactly where he wanted to be. Confident, composed, greeting guests with a controlled smile, shaking hands, accepting congratulations as if everything had been earned, as if everything was his. He hadn't seen me yet, or maybe he had, and it didn't register. Either way, it didn't matter. His confidence was intact. For now, Tiffany stood nearby, already dressed, surrounded by a few close friends. She looked exactly like someone stepping into a role she believed was permanent. Her posture straight, her expression measured. A hint of satisfaction in the way she held herself. When her eyes briefly passed over me, there was no reaction, no recognition, just dismissal. That was fine. It made things easier. I continued moving through the space until I reached a quieter corner, close enough to observe but far enough not to be part of anything. The staff moved around me naturally, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking small confirmations without even thinking about it. "Everything on schedule?" one of them asked as she passed. "Yes," I replied simply, and it was, for now. Logan appeared near the far end of the room, his expression more restrained than the others. He wasn't smiling the way Dylan was. His attention shifted too often, scanning, noticing things that didn't quite align. When his eyes met mine, he paused. Just for a second. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to register. There was no confrontation, no movement toward me, just a silent acknowledgement. Something unspoken passing between us before he looked away again. He felt it. Not the details, but the shift. The system hadn't broken yet, but it was no longer stable. I checked my phone. Not for messages, but for timing. Everything was progressing exactly as expected. No delays, no alerts, no visible disruptions. That was important, because disruption too early would create awareness, and awareness creates resistance. I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked around again. The venue was filling up now. More guests arriving, more voices blending into a single, steady hum of anticipation. Staff moving faster, final adjustments being made, everything tightening toward the moment it all needed to align. That's when small things started to shift. Nothing obvious. A coordinator pausing longer than necessary while checking a tablet. A server whispering something to another before continuing. A subtle hesitation in movement. Too small for guests to notice, but not invisible. The system wasn't breaking. It was adjusting. Across the room, Dylan frowned briefly, looking toward one of the staff members as if something hadn't been confirmed the way he expected. The moment passed quickly. He smoothed it over, returning to his conversations, his posture unchanged. He noticed, but he dismissed it. That was the pattern. Small inconsistencies, ignored, until they weren't. I stepped slightly closer to the center of the room. Not enough to be part of the main flow, but enough to feel it more clearly. The rhythm of the event, the timing of movements, the dependencies aligning, tightening, approaching the point where everything needed to work exactly as planned. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone again. This time, I didn't hesitate. One message, no explanation, no instruction beyond what was necessary. I sent it. That was all it took. There was no visible reaction, no immediate shift in the room, no sudden disruption that would draw attention. Because the system doesn't respond instantly. It responds in sequence. I slipped the phone away again and looked up, my expression unchanged, my posture steady. Around me, everything continued as if nothing had happened. Guests laughing, music playing, Dylan smiling, Tiffany preparing, Logan watching. Perfect. That's what it looked like. But perfection is fragile, and fragility doesn't show itself until pressure is applied. The ceremony seating began to fill, guests moving toward their places, guided by staff who still followed the plan exactly as it had been designed. Because the plan hadn't changed. Only the conditions had. I took a step back, positioning myself where I could see everything without being seen as part of it. The altar was set. The officiant stood ready. The final moments before everything began were unfolding exactly as expected. This was the calm, the moment where everything appears stable again, just before it isn't. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, watching as Dylan took his place, his confidence fully restored. Whatever small doubts had appeared already dismissed. He believed everything was under control. He believed the system was working. He believed this was his moment. I exhaled slowly, not out of tension, but certainty, because the most dangerous moment isn't when things start to go wrong. It's when everything looks right again. And right now, everything looked perfect, which meant there was nothing left to stop what came next. The officiant began speaking as if nothing had changed. His voice carried evenly across the room, calm and practiced, the kind of tone meant to anchor a moment like this. Guests fell silent, attention focused forward, every detail aligned, the lighting, the music fading into stillness, the quiet expectation of something meaningful about to begin. Dylan stood at the altar, shoulders squared, expression steady. Tiffany beside him, poised, composed, exactly where she believed she was meant to be. Everything held together, for a moment. Then a staff member approached the coordinator from the side, moving quickly but not urgently enough to draw attention. She leaned in, whispering something too quiet to hear, but not too quiet to notice. The coordinator's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A pause. A slight shift in posture. Eyes flicking down to the tablet in her hand, then back up, then down again. The officiant continued speaking, unaware. The guests remained focused, but the system had already begun to respond. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Across the room, Dylan noticed the hesitation. His gaze drifted briefly toward the coordinator, a small crease forming between his brows. It passed quickly, replaced by composure. By control. He dismissed it. That was his pattern. The coordinator stepped away, speaking quietly into her headset now, her tone controlled but tighter than before. Another staff member stopped mid-step, listening, adjusting, then moving again but slower. It was subtle, almost invisible, but not to everyone. Logan's head turned slightly, his attention shifting from the ceremony to the edges of the room. He wasn't watching the altar anymore. He was watching the system. A second interruption came, this time closer. One of the venue managers approached Dylan directly, leaning in just enough to speak without disrupting the ceremony. Dylan's expression tightened immediately, his jaw setting as he listened. "What do you mean?" he murmured. Not loud enough for the guests, but enough for those nearby to feel the change. The officiant faltered for half a second, then continued, voice steady, trying to maintain the rhythm. But the rhythm was already breaking. The manager spoke again, quieter this time, but firmer. Dylan's posture shifted, not confident anymore, defensive. "I approved everything," he said, voice low but sharp. "There shouldn't be any issue." The manager didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply stepped back. And that was when the second layer activated. Across the room, two servers paused near the catering station, their movements slowing as they checked something on a screen. One of them shook her head slightly, whispering to the other. Service didn't stop, but it hesitated. That was enough. Guests began to notice now, not clearly, not fully, but enough for attention to shift away from the altar. Just slightly, just for a moment. Uncertainty doesn't need to be explained. It spreads on its own. Dylan stepped forward, turning toward the coordinator now, his voice more controlled but edged with frustration. "Fix it," he said under his breath. The coordinator nodded, but her expression said something else. Not defiance. Not confusion. Limitation. "There's a verification hold," she replied quietly. "We need confirmation before proceeding." "Confirmation from who?" Dylan asked, sharper now. She hesitated. That hesitation was the answer. The officiant stopped speaking. Not by choice, but because the silence had already taken over. The music didn't resume. The guests didn't move. Everything hovered in that space between expectation and realization. And then the third layer connected. At the back of the room, a staff member approached the hotel liaison, handing over a tablet. Her eyes widened slightly as she read. Then she looked toward the front, toward Dylan, then back at the screen. Multiple points, all responding, all at once. "There's an issue with the accounts." Someone whispered, not loudly, but loud enough. That was all it took. The word issue moved through the room like a current. Not clear, not defined, but enough to change the atmosphere. Tiffany turned toward Dylan, her composure cracking for the first time. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. "Nothing," Dylan replied quickly. "It's being handled." Handled. The word didn't land the same way anymore, because nothing was being handled. Everything was being restricted. He turned back to the coordinator, his voice rising just enough to be heard by those closest. "Override it," he said. "I'm authorizing it." She didn't move. "I can't," she replied. The words were simple. Final. Dylan stared at her for a second, disbelief flickering across his face before shifting into something sharper. "What do you mean you can't?" "Authority has been reassigned pending verification," she said. "Steady now." Reassigned. The word hung in the air. He didn't understand it. Not yet. But he felt it. The shift. The loss. Across the room, Logan stepped forward slightly, his eyes moving from Dylan to me, then back again. The connection was clear now. Not the details, but the design. "This isn't a delay," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This is planned." Dylan turned sharply. "What?" But Logan wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at me. I stepped forward then. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough for the space to recognize the movement. The room didn't fall silent. It was already silent. "You didn't lose control today," I said. My voice calm, steady, carrying without effort. Dylan's eyes locked onto mine, confusion and anger colliding at once. "What did you do?" he demanded. I held his gaze. "You never had it." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to, because the system had already said them. Around us, everything stopped pretending. The ceremony was over. Not because it had been ended, but because it could no longer continue. Dylan stood there, not at the center anymore, not in control, not even part of the structure he thought he owned. Just exposed. And for the first time since this began, he understood. Silence settled over the room long before anyone moved. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows confusion. It was heavier than that, more complete. Like something had ended, even if no one had formally said it out loud. Guests began to shift in their seats. Not all at once, but gradually, a whisper here, a glance there, conversations forming in fragments, piecing together what they had just witnessed without fully understanding it. The wedding hadn't stopped. It had dissolved. Dylan stood at the altar, still in place, as if remaining there might somehow restore what had already been lost. His posture was rigid now, no longer confident, no longer controlled, just fixed. Tiffany turned away from him first. "What is happening?" she demanded. Her voice no longer composed, no longer measured. No one answered, because there was no explanation that would make sense. Not to her. Not here. Dylan stepped down from the altar, his movements sharp, deliberate, driven more by frustration than direction. He approached the coordinator again, his voice lower this time, but more intense. "Call whoever you need to call," he said. "Fix it." The coordinator didn't look at him directly. She didn't need to. "It's already been escalated," she replied. "There's nothing we can override right now. Nothing." The word landed harder than anything else that had been said. Because it wasn't temporary. It wasn't a delay. It was a boundary. Dylan ran a hand through his hair, pacing once, then stopping again as if trying to force the situation back into something manageable. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Everything was confirmed. Everything was confirmed. That had been true. Before. Now. Confirmation didn't matter. Verification did. And verification takes time. Time he didn't have. Across the room, guests were no longer pretending to focus on anything else. Conversations grew louder, more direct. People weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking why, and more importantly, who. Tiffany stepped closer to Dylan again, her voice sharp. "Urgent. You said everything was handled." "I did." He snapped back, then immediately lowered his voice as he noticed the attention around them. This is just some kind of error." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Because systems don't make errors like this. Not all at once. Not across multiple points. This wasn't an accident. And he was starting to understand that. Logan moved toward me slowly, not drawing attention, but not avoiding it either. His expression wasn't angry. It was searching. "How long?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes. "Long enough," I said. He exhaled slowly, processing, not arguing, not pushing further, because he didn't need the details. He could see the outcome. Dylan turned then, his gaze snapping toward me again. Sharper now. Clearer. "You planned this," he said. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. I tilted my head slightly. "No," I replied calmly. "You did." The words landed differently this time, because now he could feel the truth in them. "You signed the agreements," I continued. "You approved the structure. You just never understood it." His expression shifted again, anger giving way to something else. Realization. Not complete, but enough. Around us. The room continued to empty. Guests were leaving now, not waiting for anything to be resolved. The energy of the event had changed completely. There was no anticipation left, only aftermath. Staff began moving differently too, not coordinating a wedding anymore, but closing one down, quietly, efficiently, removing what had been set up, adjusting what was no longer needed, dismantling, piece by piece. Tiffany stepped back, looking between Dylan and me, her confidence gone completely now. "You're just going to let this happen?" she asked him. He didn't answer, because there was nothing left for him to control. He tried once more, turning back to the coordinator. His voice strained now. "There has to be a way to fix this." She shook her head slightly. "Not today. Final. Simple. Irreversible." Dylan stood still again, the fight leaving him not all at once, but in fragments. His shoulders dropped slightly, his gaze unfocused, as if trying to find something, anything, that could still be salvaged. There was nothing. I watched him for a moment longer, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just clarity. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't even an ending. It was a correction. "You thought removing me would simplify things," I said quietly, not raising my voice, not needing to. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. "But all you did," I continued, "was remove the part that was holding everything together." That was the truth he hadn't seen. Not until now. The last of the guests moved toward the exits, their conversations no longer quiet, no longer uncertain. The narrative was already forming, shifting, spreading beyond the room. By the time it reached the outside, It would be something else entirely. Dylan remained where he was, no longer at the center of anything, just another part of a structure that had already moved past him. Tiffany turned away again, this time not looking back. Logan stayed where he was, silent, thoughtful, no longer caught in confusion, but not fully settled either. And I stepped back, not out of retreat, but because there was nothing left to do. The system had already completed its response. Everything else was just consequence. The first siren cut through the fading noise of the venue like a blade. It wasn't loud enough to cause panic, but it didn't need to be. Everyone still inside froze for a split second, instinctively turning toward the sound as it grew closer, sharper, undeniable. Dylan stiffened, not because of fear, but because he understood before anyone said a word. Before the vehicles even came into view through the glass entrance. He knew this wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was the next step. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low but trembling beneath the surface. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth didn't need to be rushed. "I didn't do anything," I said calmly. "I just stopped protecting you." That was enough. Outside, 2 black vehicles pulled up in perfect sequence. Not rushed, not chaotic. Deliberate. Controlled. Authority doesn't need urgency to be powerful. It only needs certainty. The doors opened, and 3 individuals stepped out, dressed not in uniforms meant to intimidate, but in the kind that signify process, protocol, and inevitability, not chaos. Accountability. Guests who had lingered near the entrance instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without being told. Conversations dropped to whispers again, but this time not out of confusion, out of recognition. Something serious was happening, something official. Dylan took a step back, almost unconsciously. As the doors opened and the representatives entered, his eyes flickered between them and me, trying to piece together the connection, the timing, the intent. "You called them," he said. I shook my head slightly. They were already scheduled. That was the part he couldn't grasp. This didn't start today. It only surfaced today. The lead investigator approached with a calm, measured expression, scanning the room once before focusing directly on Dylan. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. Dylan hesitated, just for a moment. But it was enough. "Yes," he replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. "We'll need a few minutes of your time." It wasn't a request. It never is. Tiffany moved closer to Dylan, her earlier confidence replaced now by something tighter, more defensive. "What is this about?" she asked quickly. The investigator didn't look at her. "This concerns Mr. Carter's financial and contractual activities." Each word was precise, carefully chosen, designed to say everything, without saying too much. Dylan laughed then, a short, sharp sound that didn't match the situation. "This is ridiculous," he said. "There must be some kind of mistake." The investigator held his gaze. "We're here to clarify that." "Clarify. Not investigate. Not accuse. Clarify. Because when something reaches this stage, most of the work is already done." I watched Dylan carefully as the realization began to form. Not all at once, but in layers. First denial, then resistance, then calculation. He turned to me again, his voice dropping. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. I met his stare without hesitation. "It already has. Because this wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure." The investigator gestured slightly toward a quieter section of the venue. "We'd prefer to handle this privately." Dylan didn't move. Not immediately. Because moving meant accepting, and accepting meant understanding that this wasn't under his control anymore. But eventually, he nodded once. A small motion. But final. Tiffany grabbed his arm as he stepped forward. "Dylan, don't just go with them," she said, her voice tight with panic now. "You need a lawyer." He pulled his arm free. Not roughly, but decisively. I don't need anything, he said. This will be over in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That was what he still believed. That problems like this had time limits. That they could be resolved quickly, cleanly, but systems don't work that way. They unfold, step by step. He followed the investigator toward the side room, his posture still trying to hold on to authority, onto control, onto the version of himself that existed before today. The doors closed behind them, and just like that, the center of the storm moved out of sight. The room didn't return to normal. It shifted. Again. Conversations resumed. But now they were different. Sharper. More certain. People weren't speculating anymore. They were connecting dots. Logan stepped closer to me, his expression more serious than before. This is bigger than I thought, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. It always was. He studied me for a moment, then asked the question that had been building since the beginning. Why didn't you stop it sooner? I exhaled slowly, considering the answer. Because he wouldn't have learned anything, I said. He would have just adapted. That's the danger of protecting someone from consequences. You don't change them. You enable them. Logan nodded slightly, not fully agreeing, but understanding enough. Across the room, Tiffany stood alone now, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes fixed on the closed doors. The confidence, the entitlement, the certainty she had carried earlier. Gone. Replaced by something far less stable. Uncertainty. Because she had attached herself to a version of Dylan that no longer existed. And now, she had no idea what remained. Minutes passed. Not 10. More. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate. Intentional. Then finally, the doors opened. Dylan stepped out first. But he wasn't the same. Not visibly broken. Not dramatically changed. But something had shifted. Subtly. Irreversibly. The investigator followed, his expression unchanged. We'll be in contact, he said simply. Not a threat. Not a warning. A continuation. Dylan didn't respond. He didn't look at anyone. Not me. Not Tiffany. Not Logan. He just stood there for a moment, as if recalibrating, as if trying to understand where he was now compared to where he had been just hours ago. And then, slowly, he exhaled, not in relief, but in realization, because for the first time that day, he understood. This wasn't something he could fix. It was something he had to face. By the time the last chair was folded and carried away, the venue no longer looked like a place where a wedding had almost happened. It looked like somewhere something had been revealed. The flowers were still there, but they had lost their meaning. The aisle remained, but it led nowhere. The carefully arranged details, every ribbon, every candle, every polished surface, now felt like props in a story that had been interrupted at the exact moment it mattered most. I stood near the edge of the room, watching as the final pieces were dismantled. Not with chaos, but with quiet efficiency. Because endings don't always explode. Sometimes, they are simply removed. Dylan hadn't left. He was still there, standing near the back now, no longer trying to reclaim attention, no longer issuing instructions, no longer pretending control, just standing, processing. The distance between us wasn't far, but it felt different now. Not emotional, not tense, just defined. He looked at me once, briefly, as if searching for something, anger, accusation, maybe even regret. But there was nothing left to exchange, because everything that needed to be said had already happened. Tiffany had disappeared sometime earlier. No dramatic exit. No confrontation. Just gone. And somehow, that was more telling than anything she could have said. Logan approached slowly, hands in his pockets. His expression calm but thoughtful. So that's it, he asked. I glanced around the emptying room. Yes, I said. That's it. But even as I said it, I knew the truth was more complicated. Because endings like this don't close everything. They shift everything. Dylan finally moved, stepping forward, not toward me directly, but close enough that there was no pretending we weren't about to speak. For a moment, he didn't say anything. And that, more than anything, told me how much had changed. "You could have destroyed me," he said quietly. I met his gaze. I didn't need to. That was the difference. Destruction is loud. Correction is precise. He nodded slightly, absorbing the weight of that. "I didn't think you would go this far," he admitted. I tilted my head. "I didn't go far," I replied. "I just stopped going out of my way to keep you safe." The truth settled between us. Not sharp, not cruel, just undeniable. For years, I had been the one absorbing the risk, smoothing the edges, preventing consequences from reaching him. And he had mistaken that for normal, for entitlement, for something that would always be there, until it wasn't. "I built everything," he said, though there was no pride left in it now. "Yes," I agreed. "And then you decided to gamble it. Not with intention, but with arrogance, with the belief that nothing could touch him." That belief was gone now, replaced by something quieter, something more real. Dylan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair again, but this time not out of frustration, out of understanding. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked past him, toward the open doors, where the outside light filtered in, steady, unchanged, indifferent to everything that had just unfolded. "That depends on what you do next," I said, "because consequences don't end a story. They begin a new one." He nodded again, this time more firmly, as if accepting something he could no longer avoid. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, not defeated, not broken, but no longer protected. And that was the difference that mattered. Logan watched him go, then turned back to me. "You're not going after him?" he asked. I shook my head. There's nothing left to chase. Revenge isn't always about taking something from someone. Sometimes, it's about letting them keep everything they chose, including the consequences. The room was almost empty now. The last of the staff moved quietly, finishing their work, resetting the space for whatever would come next. Life doesn't pause for one moment. It continues. Always. I took one final look around, not searching for anything, just acknowledging what had been, what had changed, and what would never return to what it was. And then, I walked away, not as someone who had lost, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had finally stepped out of a story that was never meant to define her. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that the most powerful kind of revenge isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't need an audience. It's quiet. It's controlled. It's the moment you stop protecting someone who was never protecting you. And suddenly, everything they built without accountability begins to collapse under its own weight. If this story made you think, or if you've ever found yourself in a situation where walking away felt harder than fighting back, take a moment and share your thoughts below. I read every comment, and your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want more stories like this, stories about truth, consequences, and the kind of justice that doesn't need noise, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most important endings are the ones that teach you how to begin again. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.